This morning I want to talk about faith. As I'm reading my chapter by chapter and verse by verse, going through the Bible, I'm going through the book of Mark. Now, for the last few years, I've been teaching the book of Mark in our in-person Bible studies at WAYpointONE. But it's interesting that there's always something new, something to gain by reading it and reading it and reading it over and over again. The minute you think you've got it all figured out, read it again. Because the Spirit wants to tell you and wants to bring to you other things that maybe you didn't consider. That's what happened to me today as I'm reading back through Mark and picking up on things I hadn't noticed before. It's things I hadn't taught before. I'm in the book of Mark, and I'm in chapter 6, verse 53. And this is what the Word of God says. New King James Version is what I'm reading. When they had crossed over, they came to the land of Gennesaret and anchored there. And when they came out of the boat, immediately the people recognized him as Jesus, ran through that whole surrounding region and began to carry about on beds those who were sick to wherever they heard he was. Wherever he entered into a village, cities, or the country, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and begged him that they might just touch the hem of his garment. And as many as touched him were made well. Now, this is an interesting picture. But I need to make a point about faith. So many times we question what we're seeing. If you're kind of a pragmatic type of person, maybe you believe simply in what your senses can see and taste and hear and touch. And if there's not evidence, then it's not believable. And so many times we see God working in miraculous ways naturally, so that you could either accept it as being God's work, or you could just explain it away as being plain old happenstance or luck or just the way of things. Stepping back and saying, you know what, there's no supernatural anything going on here. But if you read this, that doesn't seem to be happening here. A pragmatic person would say there's no way by touching a man's garment that a person would be made well, would be healed of anything. Not even a cold or a nosebleed or a hangnail. But you read this story and it says here that when people heard about Jesus, then they knew that Jesus had healing power, and some people believed in him greatly, other people didn't. And there were those who were always seeking after Jesus just to see something amazing, just to see a sign. We see that throughout all of the Pharisees looking for a sign, looking for a sign, looking for a sign. Do you notice that every time he did a miracle, only those people who believed in Jesus believed? The people that saw a miracle but didn't believe in Jesus, it just went in one ear and out the other. It's because Jesus brings the Word of God, and the Spirit pulls you towards the Word of God, and then he justifies the Word of God and what he has said by his miracles. He isn't proving himself through his miracles. He's proving himself through the Word of God and then justifying it with a miracle. You have to choose to understand him and who he is before the miracle even makes a sense here. So these people are seeing and hearing about Jesus, and they're bringing, wherever they are, all throughout the country, they're showing up with people who are sick, who are injured, and who are dealing. And they lay them down there, and it says they just believe that, if I just can touch his garment, then I'll be made well. And the last line in verse 56 says, wherever he entered into villages, cities, or the country, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and begged him that they might just touch the hem of his garment. And as many as touched him were made well. So if you touched his garment, you were made well. But the way that it is written simply and clearly seems to say that if you didn't touch his garment, you weren't made well. And hence the point of faith. Because if you don't believe that you could touch a man's garment, Jesus's garment specifically, and be made well, then your faith won't heal you. No doubt we're seeing this point played out in a story several chapters before in Mark chapter 5, where they heard this woman touch the hem of his garment and he healed her of the point of the issue of blood that she'd had for 12 years. Physicians couldn't fix it. She believed by faith to touch his hem. And so this is what they're hearing. Now, you still have to have the faith to believe that touching Jesus's garment's going to heal you. No normal pragmatic person's going to say, yeah, that sure is possible. So what's being illustrated there is simple. Faith in Jesus Christ will make you well. Let's go back to chapter 5, verse 21. Now, when Jesus had crossed over again by boat to the other side, a great multitude gathered to him, and he was by the sea. And behold, one of the rulers of the synagogue named Jairus, by name, and when he saw him, he fell at his feet and begged him earnestly, saying, my little daughter lies at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on him, that she may be healed, and she will live. So Jesus went with him, and a great multitude followed him and thronged him. Now here's a man who is the head of the synagogue, the Jewish synagogue. And although the religious leaders believe that Jesus is the enemy, this man is confronted with a little bit of tension. He's confronted with the idea that, yeah, Jesus is a problem. Yeah, it might be blaspheming God. Yeah, I mean, all of my compatriots want to destroy him and put him to death, but my little daughter is sick. And it seems to me Jesus may be the only hope. What do you do in that point? When what is so important to you goes against what the world is saying? It causes a tension. But Jairus goes to Jesus believing that Jesus can heal his daughter. He would have by no means gone to a blasphemer. He would have by no means gone to some guy who's running around just making statements about things. We know that Jesus must have been who he says he was. And a lot of people want to say, you know what, Jesus was a good teacher, he's a good person, but he wasn't the Son of God. That's impossible. That's impossible. That's a problem. Because either Jesus was a liar, a lunatic, or he's truly who he says he is, but he can't just be a moral judge. Because if he says the things he said in the Bible, either you have delusions of grandeur and therefore you're mentally ill, or you're just lying about it, or you're who you say you are. You can't be a moral person and tell those kinds of lies. It's antithetical. So Jairus here is kind of left with this idea and this thought. So he's kind of at the bottom of himself here, and he's reaching out to the only thing he thinks he has left, which is Jesus. And he's in town, and he boldly goes to Jesus in faith. Verse 25 says, but now a certain woman had a flow of blood for 12 years and had suffered many things from many physicians. And she had spent all that she had and she was no better, but rather grew worse. And when she heard about Jesus, she came behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. Well, that sounds familiar, touching the hem of his garment. For she said, if only I may touch his clothes, then I will be made well. This woman had tremendous faith because she believed that touching a man who could, all she needed to do is touch his garment. Like, here's Jairus who wants him to lay hands on his daughter. And here is a woman that says, all I have to do is touch his clothes and I can be made well. That is incredible faith. Says, all I have to do is touch his garment, and I shall be made well. And immediately, verse 29, the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of the affliction. And Jesus, immediately knowing in himself that power had gone out of him, turned around in the crowd and said, who touched my clothes? But his disciples said to him, you see the multitude thronging you, and you say, who touched me? And he looked around to see her who has done this thing. But the woman, fearing and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. Then he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace, be healed of your affliction. Now this is an interesting tension. Here is a woman who is unclean, yet she touches a rabbi. And that could lead you to tremendous punishment, yet she had faith in the fact she was at the bottom of herself. She dealt with this for years and years and years with no help from the doctors, and she said, you know what? It's worth the risk. Did you know that faith has some risk to it? The Bible tells us the definition of faith. The definition of faith is in Hebrews chapter 11. It says, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. There is an opportunity. There is a place in belief and faith that you're going to have to step out on a limb because it's not all given to you. We can have evidence that something's true up until a certain point, and then whatever takes it to the rest of the truth, this space over here, is faith. So she had a problem. She needed to fix it. She knew by probably witness statements and things that she had heard that Jesus could heal anything, because we read through this even up until the point in Mark 5 when she's made well. Then there's all kinds of, there's the paralytic who comes through the roof. There's the man with the withered hand in the synagogue. There's people with unclean spirits. This is going on. She knows that he has the ability. She knows that Jesus can do it up until a certain point. But she has to be healed, which is about this far away. This last part over here where she has no evidence, like touching his garment, she's got to have faith. She has to step out on a limb. And she's doing it here in a tremendous way because Jesus is known now as a rabbi, and you're not supposed to touch anybody who's bleeding. That makes you unclean. You can't go to the synagogue. But she is desperate. And her desperation shows in her faith. And Jesus recognizes that desperation and heals her. Verse 35 says, while he was still speaking, some came from the ruler of the synagogue's house and said, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? And as soon as Jesus heard the word that was spoken, he said to the ruler of the synagogue, do not be afraid, only believe. Now the servants believed that maybe the servants believed that Jesus could heal Jairus' little daughter while she was still alive, but hey, don't bother him now, she's dead. Nobody has seen a raising from a dead yet. That hasn't happened. Jairus, is just up, he's beside himself because in the midst of trying to get to her while she was still alive, they stopped to deal with this woman. And Jesus, seeing his discomfort, said, look, don't worry, don't be afraid. Just believe. Just have faith in me. Have faith in what I'm saying. You realize that when I make this statement to you, that I've got the control and I know how this is going to end. Just believe. And we see that all intents and purposes that Jairus does, because he doesn't stop to say, you know what, I don't want to bother you any further. No, they go on to his house. Verse 37 says, and he permitted no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And he came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue and saw a tumult, and those who wept and wailed loudly. And when he came in, he said, why is this commotion and weep? Your child is not dead, she's sleeping. Now Jesus, interesting, makes this statement. Now this statement has two folds in my opinion. One, he makes this statement to discuss the fact that when they see Jairus' daughter alive, that He didn't say, I'm here to raise the dead. No, she's sleeping. Don't worry, she's sleeping. And when you see her, you will believe what I said, that she's sleeping. Or he says this too to test their faith, because they may very clearly know that the girl is dead. You pay these people to come in and weep and wail for you. They may not even seen her. They just showed up and started screaming. And it's an interesting thing. I've been on a number of calls where families, because of deaths of loved ones, wailed and wept in the house, and it's an interesting situation. But Jesus tests their faith. If you know she's dead and you see her alive, believe in me. If you think she's dead and you don't believe in me, I've already given you the out here when you see her alive in a minute. And of course they ridicule him. Verse 40, they ridiculed him. Nobody had faith that Jesus was going to show up and do something crazy. So he took the father and the mother of the child and those who were with him, and they entered there in where the child was lying. He kicks all these people out of the house and goes upstairs to find the child where she had died. 41 says, and then he took the child by the hand and said to her, Talitha cumi, which is translated, little girl, I say to you, arise. Immediately the girl arose and walked, for she was 12 years of age. And they were overcome with great amazement. But he commanded them strictly that no one should know it, and said that something should be given to her to eat. Jesus says, don't tell them I raised her from the dead. I already set the narrative. That if they didn't believe that I was there to raise her from the dead, she was just sleeping. It's a normal kind of thing to believe. Because how would you explain that if Jesus, if now you see Jairus' daughter alive and you thought she was dead, without this explanation? But God does things in a very normal way. And you have to choose whether you believe in God, that it was miraculous, or you don't believe that God does miraculous things and there's some sort of explanation that you can come up with. Man has been very busy trying to come up with explanations for everything that the Bible has to offer, to include the flood and countless other things that have happened. The resurrection of Jesus. Lots of evidence about it. People wrote about it. People saw about it. But we're always looking for explanations to explain God's goodness and God's miraculous ways away. You have to step out in faith. You have to go out on a limb to believe in Jesus. To believe that what God can do for you is true. And they believe by faith, and then they see Jesus raise their dead daughter from the grave, and they're amazed. And that is always the outcome when you have faith in Jesus and he does something, you're amazed. I've seen a number of things happen in my life through my career as a police officer, things that I believed that Jesus was there, even if I was stepping out a little bit in faith, stepping out on a limb to believe. And then when it came to pass, I knew Jesus was involved, and I was amazed too. I have to tell you, it's an amazingly exciting time to live a life looking for that kind of stuff. To live a life that's slightly on the edge, to believe that Jesus might do something amazing you've never seen, but you have to have eyes open to see it. Because if you don't, you're going to be like these people. Hey, she's sleeping. Hey, there's Jairus' daughter. She's alive. Well, I guess Jesus was right. She was just sleeping. No belief in what Jesus can do. So we get back to this point about touching garments. The woman of blood touched the garment. She believed that all I have to do is touch his garment and I'll be made well. He has that kind of power. He has that kind of authority. He is who he says he is. I have faith. I can't prove it, but I believe it, and I'll step out on a limb to look for the answer that I hope he will give me. And he does, and she is healed. So when you get to this other place here in chapter 6, where people heard that he had shown up, maybe they'd heard this story, that the woman with that problem of blood touched the garment and was made well. So here they are, bringing all these sick people into Gennesaret and into the marketplaces and from all over. And it says that as many had touched his garment were made well. And it seems to me it's left a place where it's either you touch his garment because you believe in Jesus and you believe that touching a garment will bring you to be made well, stepping out on a limb, or you don't believe in it and you're pragmatic about it and you're realistic about it and you don't see Jesus in everything that's going on here and you say, you know what, that's impossible. Touching a man's garment doesn't heal me of my leprosy. Doesn't cast out this demon, doesn't make me walk, doesn't allow me to see. And oh, how much these people missed out. But that brings a good question. Why not just try? Why not see if it's true? You've heard the stories. Why don't you look into it? Investigate it. Why don't you try it? We see that in the Old Testament. We see that in a man named Naaman. Naaman is a Syrian king, is a military man who has leprosy. And he hears the fact that there is a man in Israel named Elisha who can heal him. And so this is what happens. We find it in 2 Kings chapter 5. Now, Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, he's a Gentile, he's not even a Jew, was a great and honorable man in the eyes of his master, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. He was also a mighty man of valor, but he was a leper. And the Syrians had gone out on raids and had brought back captive a young girl from the land of Israel. She waited on Naaman's wife. And then she said to her mistress, if only my master were with the prophet who is in Samaria, for he would heal him of his leprosy. And Naaman went in and told his master, saying, thus and thus said the girl who is from the land of Israel. So they go in, they win in Israel, they take this captive girl, and they bring her back to Syria. And she is Israeli. And she says that there's a man who can heal him if he just goes and talks to him. Well, that's a pretty honest invitation. Why don't you just go see? So Naaman goes back to his master and says, this is what this girl said. He said that there's this guy out there. His name is Elisha, and he can do something about it. He may be able to heal my leprosy so that I can continue doing what I'm doing. Verse 5 says, the king of Syria said, go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel. So he departed, and he took with him 10 talents of silver, 10,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothing. And then he brought the letter to the king of Israel, which said, now be advised, when this letter comes to you, that I have sent Naaman my servant to you, that you may heal him of his leprosy. So in this case, the king of Syria believes that it's the king of Israel who can do all of this. Maybe it's because kings have pomp and circumstance and power, and that would be the general gist of the understanding of how this would all work, that the most powerful man in the nation would have this opportunity. And when this letter gets to the king, he kind of freaks out a little bit. Verse 7 says, and it happened when the king of Israel read the letter that he tore his clothes and he said, am I a god? Am I God to kill and make alive, that this man sends a man to me to heal his leprosy? Therefore, please consider and see how he seeks a quarrel with me. He's over here saying, you fix my guy of leprosy, knowing that he can't, and when he can't, then it's going to cause Syria to be angry, and we're going to cause a war. It's almost like a false flag in some ways. Ask the king of Israel for something that's impossible, and then when he can't do it, use it as pretense to cause a war. Great. That's what he's saying here. Verse 8 says, so it was that Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, and he sent to the king, saying, why have you torn your clothes? Please let him come to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel. I realize that the king of Israel at this time doesn't believe in Elisha, doesn't know what Elisha can do, doesn't know that he's a prophet. At this time, everybody's in rank rebellion against God. And the prophets have been killed over these times. So Elisha, a prophet, the only one who talks to God, hears about this king and the king of Israel, and he says, look, just send him my way and I'll take care of it. So verse 9 says, then Naaman went with his horses and chariots, and he stood at the door of Elisha's house. And Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh will be restored to you, and you shall be clean. God works in such interesting ways. Knowing that Naaman has come all this way, that he's a high-ranking military official, and that the king, he's not meeting with the king, he's just meeting with this dude in his house. He goes and he knocks on this house, awaiting Elisha, who's going to show preeminence to his man of high ranking, and yet Elisha sends him a servant and says, I'm not even good enough to see you personally. I'll just send you my servant, and my servant will give you the thing. Just go down to the Jordan and dip in there 7 times, and you'll be healed. And this inflames Naaman because he feels disrespected. Verse 11, but Naaman became furious. And he went away and said, indeed, I said to myself, he will surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the place and heal the leprosy. He's like, this guy should have just come out, seen me, gone, you're healed and I'll be healed. And then I'll go. He's asking me to go get in the river, the dirty river. It continues, verse 12, are not the Abana and the Parfar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean? So he turned and he went away in a rage. The dirty Jordan, he gets so offended. He's like, not only did Elisha not come out and see me himself and just wave his hand and do something, but his servant came out and he told me to go and jump in a dirty river. I could go back to Damascus and jump in clean rivers. Wouldn't that heal me okay? This is dumb. And he leaves. And he leaves. But thank goodness for those who are wise. This is so he turned and he went away in a rage. Verse 13, and his servant came near and spoke to him, and he said, my father, if the prophet had told you to do something great, would you not have done it? How much more than when he says to you, wash and be clean? So he went down and he dipped 7 times in the Jordan, according to the saying of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a child, and he was clean. His servant says, had he asked you to stand on your head and twirl a drum and say a prayer and call down fire, you would have done that because it would have made sense to you. But all he said was go down into the water and just get in it and you'll be clean. Why won't you just try him? Why wouldn't you just do it? It's easy. It's easy. Why wouldn't you just touch the hem of his garment, whether you believed it or not? Naaman says, okay, well, maybe you're right. I come all this way. He said, just go get in the water 7 times. I'll go do that. And he does, and he's made clean. So many times we talk ourselves out of our own faith because it doesn't make sense. God doesn't work in ways that make sense. God has made things work very normally. He's given this world, he's created this world, and he's created all these laws that allow us to count on them, like gravity. He told us the day and night and spring and summer and harvest, seed time and harvest. These would all continue on time, all time until I end that. Promises that tell us that life will go on and life can be counted upon. But God is in control of all of those things, and he can step out He stopped, he backed up the sun for Joshua so that they could win the battle. He backed up the moon to prove to Hezekiah that he was who he said he was when he told him that he was going to prolong his life for 15 years. God can do anything he wants to. And so if you heard that Jesus, who's healing people, all you have to do is touch his garment, why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you test it? Step out on a limb and give him time to work. Jesus was interesting. He speaks about Naaman in the book of Luke. Listen to what it says. He says, you know what? I was sent here as the Messiah, and you guys don't believe me because you've known me since I was born. And he says to him, he says in verse 23 of Luke 4, he said this to him, you will surely say this proverb to me, physician, heal yourself. Whatever we have heard done in Capernaum, do also here in your country. And then he said, assuredly, I say to you, no prophet is accepted in his own country. Why? Because how can you be a prophet or born of God when we've known you all your life? You were born here. You're the son of Joseph, the carpenter. How can you possibly be the son of God? How can you possibly be a prophet? You've not shown us anything up until the point you're 33 years old. You walked into our synagogue and you told us that you fulfilled the great Isaiah's prophecy. They don't see what he's been doing as being the glue that holds that prophecy together. And he says that. He says, look, I'm not accepted in my own country. You don't have the faith to see what I've been doing and collect your thoughts and put it back on me. And this is where he says in 25, but I tell you the truth, truly, many widows were in Israel in the days of Elijah, when the heavens were shut up 3 years and 6 months, and there was a great famine throughout all the land. But to none of them was Elijah sent, except for Zarephath, the region of Sidon, to a woman who was a widow. And many lepers were in Israel in the time of Elisha the prophet, and none of them was cleansed except Naaman the Syrian. And the point he's making is this. In Israel, there were a lot of people suffering from leprosy, and there was a lot of people who were suffering from starvation and destitution and poverty. But you didn't believe in Elisha or Elijah. God only worked with them in Naaman and this woman from Zarephath. They're the only ones who had any faith to believe that Elijah or Elisha could carry out what God said he would do. You guys are at fault for not believing that I had sent a prophet to tell you these things. You had blown them off, just like you blew off all the other prophets. So much so that they had them murdered. So many of them were martyred. And they did the same thing with Jesus. So the point about faith is this. Why wouldn't you just reach out and touch his garments? If you were sick and you had no other opportunities, maybe it's time to step out on a limb. Meet Jesus, because he'll meet you where you are. Seek after the one who has created all things and who bends time and who can bend the day and bend natural rules, and he created healing. He can provide everything. He owns everything on 1,000 hills, all the cattle on 1,000 hills. He will provide for your needs. But you need to show faith in him. You need to step out on that limb, a little bit uncomfortable, and seek after what you may think isn't possible, but it is, and everything is possible with him. Everything is possible with God. Remember, everything is in his control. He's the preeminence. He holds all things together. All things consist in this universe because of that very thing. So my prayer for you today is this. When you're seeking after the difficulties in your life, the needs and the sicknesses and the hardships and the storms and the wayward kids and all of this stuff, why wouldn't you just reach out to Jesus and touch his garment and see what happens? I promise you, seeking the Lord while you still can will change everything. I hope this brings you some great encouragement and maybe a charge in your heart to seek deep down inside, because we all have the will to be We were created by God. We were made in the image of God. And the only question you have is, do you want to serve the God who created you, or do you want to make it up on your own? The minute you make it up on your own, he's going to tell you, then be gone. You don't need good things from me. And when you die here and you're out of time, then hell comes. Separation from God. He says, you go do it your own way. You think you're God? Go ahead. But realize that God wants to have a relationship with you. And all that it has to be is the acceptance of Jesus Christ through your heart. To believe that you're a sinner and that you need him to wipe out that ledger so that you can then be reconciled back to God as being a righteous being. He's not taking away your freedoms. He's giving you all things. You have to understand that our sin has locked us into this cage. And our sin destroys us slowly, like leprosy, until we don't feel anything anymore and until we die. But although Satan wants to kill, steal, and destroy, the Bible tells us that Jesus came to give life and give it more abundantly. And I can promise you that's true. My life has not ever been better and more fulfilled than the day I accepted Jesus and started to watch him work in my life. I reached out and touched the hem of his garment, and he healed me. I promise you that it's something that he can do. But you got to step out in faith. You got to understand, back to Hebrews chapter 11, you've got to understand this. This is incredibly important. Verse 6 says, but without faith, it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that God is who he says he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. You need to believe God is who he says he is, and that if you seek him, he will reward you. That's faith. An incredible faith. A life-altering, life-changing faith. Go this week and seek after Jesus. Touch his garments. Listen for his voice. Step out on a limb in faith and believe. And you will be healed. Be blessed.